Hello, welcome back to my channel. My name's Stephen. I'm a traditionally published fantasy author. Today I'm talking about the worst tips for writing evil characters. I'm going to go through some of the ones that I've seen online, I've seen other people talking about, and talk about why they're really bad when you're designing villains, and then talk about some potential ideas for what you could actually do to counter these really bad ideas. The first awful tip is to make your villains pure evil, absolutely mustache twirling, with no scruples, no morals, and no vulnerabilities or anything at all, just evil incarnate. And this is absolutely a terrible idea because it's completely unbelievable and no one will fall for it. No one is born pure evil. You can get into the idea of nature versus nurture if you want, but I think it is a combination of both. And in this case, when you're creating villains, you want them to feel rounded characters. Every character should believe that they are the main character in the story, including the villains. Now, they may not think that they're the hero of the story, but they should believe that they're the most important person within the story that you have created and within this world. The best example I can think of are two characters who essentially, depending on where you stand, one could be seen as the hero and so could the other, and one could be seen as a villain and so is the other. And this goes back to the comics that were created in the 1960s, and this is the X-Men. You have Charles Xavier, Professor X on one side, and you have Magneto, Eric Lenscher, on the other side. And Magneto, all of his opinions have been coloured by what he has experienced as a child. He was a German Jew during World War II, so therefore he was put into a concentration camp, and even worse, on top of that, he turned out to be a mutant. He was treated very, very badly, as you would expect, and so he came out believing that humans and mutants could not get along in any capacity after he saw how Jews were treated by the Germans. So therefore, he was absolutely against the idea of all living together. He believes that mutants are superior, they should take over, they should rule. On the other side, you have Charles Xavier. Professor X believes that they can get along, and despite being the next potential evolution of humans, they're in the minority mutants, and therefore there should be a way that they can live together as we have done in the past with other groups that have integrated within our society. So some people see Magneto's views and all of his decisions as evil because he does go around killing people, sometimes innocent people, but he believes it's for the greater good, whereas Professor X is always trying to convince his friend to see it from his perspective and believe that they should be able to live together, they shouldn't always be fighting. So some people just think Magneto is evil, and it's not true at all. He's a lot more complicated a character, he's very rounded, and there's a lot going on which makes him interesting. And of course the opposite side of this, as I said, is Professor X. Now if you know, I mentioned when the comics were created during the 1960s, then you have a lot of civil rights liberties in America. You have the Freedom Riders, you have the March on the Mile, you have the March at Selma, you have the speech at the Washington Monument given by Martin Luther King Jr. and John Lewis, Senator John Lewis, amongst many others. And this was very much about integration, people who were different living together and being treated equally. And this is where part of the idea came from mutants. And of course Professor X is promoting that idea of integration, of treating everybody equally despite them being different. And so, that seems like a very good idea from his point of view, but obviously Magneto is seeing it from a very different point of view. So is he a hero in terms of general comics history and storytelling? Some would say yes, but from where the other people are sitting, they think he's quite naive. He doesn't understand. They wouldn't say that he's evil, they just think that hasn't really understood what humans are capable of. But, I've never really said either of them are pure evil or pure good. They all have faults, they all have good and bad points to each character because they're very three-dimensional people, and that's what you want for your villains. The worst thing would be was if Magneto went around killing people, no concerns, no compunctions, kill anybody, has no problems whatsoever, and he just does it. And that takes you back to the kind of evil incarnate. You have to give your villain a reason. Why are they doing this thing? What is their goal? What is they want to achieve? What are they trying to move towards? There has to be something that they want. It can't just be, I'm killing these people just cause. Now you could go and say, you look at characters like the Joker from the comics, who's the kind of foil for Batman, and he just wants to cause chaos. But That's kind of a rare creature. You don't see all of Batman's rogues being that. They all want something very specific and they all go about it in a very particular way. So when you're creating your villains, if you have more than one, they should want different things. They should have different goals in mind. They should have been raised differently, and therefore they come at the world from a different viewpoint. And that's what you really need to think about. The next awful tip for creating villains is to make them a pale shade of grey. This is where the writer doesn't want to commit fully to making a character evil to whatever degree that is. Not the pure evil, but just doing awful things. They're afraid that if they fully engage and say this character has murdered, women and children, like, oh, that's going too far. No, I won't do that. I'll just say they've killed some people and they were quite bad people. That isn't how you should go to approach it either. A character doesn't have to be likeable, but they have to be interesting. And you can have villains that people hate, that they want to see them fall, so they keep reading because they're an interesting character. But if you tone down all of the things that your villain does because it makes you uncomfortable, then that's really not a good idea. You're not serving the story well, you're not serving the character well, and the readers won't believe it either, that there's this person that everybody's afraid of and they all talk about it an awful lot, but when you see the character, they don't actually do anything evil, or they're afraid to do something really bad because you as a writer are afraid of doing that and making someone who is quite appalling. So you shouldn't just have them do things that you can stomach, or you think, oh, that's not too bad, I'll have my villain do that. I mean, I've read some characters that are really awful people, but I find them really, really interesting and engaging. So, off the top of my head, Joe Abercrombie created Glockter. Now, this guy is a torturer. He does awful things to people, but he's really interesting. Some might say, well, maybe he's not a villain, but he does go around torturing people, which isn't a good thing. But he's very funny, he's very witty, and he's very layered, and we find out how he ended up the way he is, which makes you kind of not overlook, but you accept some of the things that have happened to that character. You may not forgive them, but you want to find out more about him. And you still accuse him of doing evil things, and you could still say he's villainous, but he's not pure evil, just doing it just because. There are very deep and personal meanings for his actions. Your characters are not you. You need to be able to commit to them, good or bad. If you can't, and they just come out quite lifeless and kind of middle of the road and just very kind of meh, then the readers won't engage with them. They want heroes and they want villains that they can cheer on or hate and really want to see them fall. I mean, it's great to have a villain that's doing all sorts of terrible things and then they get the comeuppance. Readers love that kind of thing. So, build layers into your villain and make them do terrible things if that is part of the story. Engage fully one way or the other. Don't go middle of the road. Don't be squeamish. Write characters that are morally at odds with you. They don't have to be in line with you in everything the way you think, and nor should they be. Your characters are not you. They've come from your imagination, but equally, you're not all of them. I'm not a wizard, I'm not a warrior, I'm not a knight, I'm not a priest. I've done all these characters. I've created all of them, and they all have strengths and weaknesses, and some of them are really strong believers, and some of them are really strong atheists. I can't be both, I have to be one or the other. They're not me. There's lots of different layers, lots of different characters, lots of different jobs. And equally, creating villains is no different. They are not you, they're just part of your imagination. And this comes back to motivation. What does your villain want? When they do all of these terrible things, why are they doing it? Is it just for fear and intimidation? Is it that they're doing it for a grab for power? They could be killing a whole bunch of people in order to take over. Is it that they are some kind of religious fanatic and therefore they believe what they're doing is for the greater good and they're going to help lots of other people? Is it some kind of a grab for power? If there's like a civil war and this character sees themselves as being the great saviour, but they have to kill a bunch of people to get there, to seize the throne maybe. But from a character from the other side, they see them as this rebel who's going to kill all and slaughter all these people. But of course, history is written by the victors. So if this person comes along, kills all these people, seizes the throne, in a few years' time, they'll write the story of how they struck down the terrible person who sat on a throne that was really evil and all the rest of it. And there again, it comes down to perspective. So give your character, your villain, a good motivation. And the other reason not to make them only a pale shade of grey, is that your villain should not be redeemable. That shouldn't have to be something that is built into the character by making them quite pale. Now, perhaps one of your characters is a villain or someone who's quite morally grey, and maybe they are going to be redeemed, but not every villain is there to be redeemed. That is not the purpose of villains in the story. That is not their goal. That is not what they're there for. You're not there to save the villain. The readers and the heroes are not always looking for that. You have to have strong and believable antagonists and protagonists. Create conflict, and that's what you want in a good story. So make someone layered, give them a purpose, give them a strong motivation, know what they're going for in the back of their mind, even if it never comes out fully on the page. Build that into the character when you create them. The next really bad tip for creating villains is to make them sympathetic. Not all villains have to be sympathetic, someone that you can understand and cry for when you find out more about them. Here's a really good example. A character who's a really badass villain, who's really powerful, and then you find out actually he turned out to be a hero who went to the dark side and also happens to be the father of the next great hope for the next generation. Yes, I'm talking about Darth Vader. Here's how to ruin a really great villain. We go back in time and we see his childhood and find out some of the really sad little things that happened to him when he was a small boy. And then therefore we see him crying about his mum, and then he just kills people because he's angry, and you undermined all of the amazing work that they did in the really good trilogy, episodes 4, 5 and 6, by having 1, 2 and 3 that just, I lost all sympathy, I lost all respect, I lost all fear of this character, because every time I saw the sort of black famous helmet of Darth Vader, I just pictured a little boy in the pod race. And he's no longer intimidating or scary. This is how you can rob a great villain of their power, by just trying to build sympathy for them. You don't have to do that. So part of this would be having tragedy built into the villain's backstory in order to generate sympathy, make people feel sorry for them, and then think, oh, maybe they're not too bad, or forgive them for the terrible things they've done because you understand what the tragedy is, and thinking, is that okay? They had a terrible childhood and now they killed all these people, so does that make it right? And therefore you're focusing on the wrong things. If you're kind of getting into the moral quandaries of the villain, it can be interesting, but building tragedy as a kind of backdoor way, an excuse for it, and that's where they're lashing out at people because of something that bad that happens to them, I really don't think that's a good idea, a really good way to build a villain. A good tip for making a villain would be, think about some of the monsters that you've seen in horror films. Some of the really, really scary ones are the most powerful ones that just keep going. They're relentless. They're more than human. They're sometimes super strong or supernaturally powerful. And no matter what you throw at them, they just keep coming. That kind of determination in a villain, not necessarily supernatural or making them some kind of giant unkillable monster, but that kind of drive, that kind of ambition, that kind of, no matter what's thrown as them, just as you give your heroes some kind of drive, they get knocked back, maybe they lose a battle and the hero's celebrating, but they learn from it and they come back and they get better and they get stronger and they move forward towards their goal, towards their ambition, whatever it is they're after. That's quite a terrifying villain, someone that doesn't just get knocked back, oh, and then they just give up and go away. They come back again and they won't quit. Make your villain interesting. Give them wants and desires, but give them friends. Give them family if you want. Give them a backstory, even if you don't reveal it. Plot out some of the main beats of their life and all the things that they've experienced. Make them a rounded, three-dimensional character, not a lion that's got a thorn in its paw and therefore it's lashing out at someone. Make them feel like a real person for the reader. Another really bad tip for creating villains is to make them over the top. Now, whether this is someone like a femme fatale who's all sexy and seductress and yes, and dominating men and has them at footstools and I'm showing you, and it's too much. And of course the flip side of that is having someone with an enormous personality, this kind of giant voiced man who walks into the room and just kills his servant and walks on to the next person and just kills them, and he's always making monologues and giving great speeches and things, and We've seen that so many times in bad films and in bad books. So don't make them over the top. Make them layered. Now think about some great villains from literature. Think about Sherlock Holmes and Moriarty. He was really, really intelligent. He had his own plans, as I've talked about, ideas and ambitions. But he is very much the dark half of Sherlock Holmes. He's what could have happened to Sherlock Holmes. And of course, Sherlock Holmes is the hero in the story, but of course he was also a heroin addict, and he had massive problems in terms of his personality. He wasn't able to get on with most people because he was an appalling person. He just wasn't very nice at all, but he was very good at what he did, and therefore that's what made him an interesting character. But the line between him and Moriarty at times was pretty thin. Moriarty, fascinating guy, interesting backstory, lots going on with him, intelligent. That's what I like to see in a villain. A final note on point of view. Some books have a point of view from 2, 3, 4 characters, and it's usually them talking about the villain, what they've done, or you might see them in scenes. But you could have a point of view from the actual villain yourself, one of the 3 or 4 in your book if you're writing fantasy or something like that with multiple points of view. What does that do for you as a writer if you're inside this person's head and you're writing them? And obviously talking about them to the reader, they're learning about them, they're seeing their actions, but if you're writing from their point of view as well, the reader will get to hear some of their inner thoughts, hear about what they're doing, why they're doing it, and get to understand them a little better. And that's not to say they're therefore going to sympathise with them and they're going to understand them. They could essentially be hate reading those chapters because they're waiting for them to fall. But it opens a lot of doors, interesting storytelling techniques that you can apply if you're telling it from a character's point of view. And equally, someone that is just one of the point of views could end up being a villain in the story further down the road. Maybe not, in that first book or that first few chapters, but towards the end of the book, something could happen that sends them down a dark path, or at least a different path from some of the other main characters. And therefore, they would view this character then as a villain. But is he a villain to the reader or not? That's kind of for them to decide and for you to build into the story. But point of view allows you to do all sorts of different things, and having a point of view story from the villain's perspective is another interesting way to approach it. Before I go on to my last point, I always forget, so I'm going to do this now. If this video is useful, please like and subscribe. If you want to join the writing community I've set up, Headspace, this is for writers to share our work, comment on each other's query letters, submissions, first few chapters, and try and improve our writing craft. Also, there's a link down below to an ebook. I've given a bunch of writing advice in there. It's on Kindle and it's free on Kindle Unlimited, so check that out too. I would really appreciate it. The final type of villain that you could have is a remote villain. Now, I've said in some books you hear them talk about a character and you only ever see what they do at a distance. If you think about Game of Thrones and you think about the Winter King, we see him many, many times through different people's perspective. But what you could do if you have a similar character like that and you have them viewed through different perspectives of your characters, you could then add layers to that person because they're seeing the villain slightly different because each point of view is slightly different. So they could focus on different aspects. It allows you to build more into the villain without actually having it from their point of view. They could make discoveries in different points of view that gives you more information about the character. And gradually, as the reader moves through the story, they start to build up a picture of this person. So even though we never have the story from their point of view, you get more information about them, and it creates a more rounded feel rather than having 3 points of view of your main characters and all of them just says, oh yeah, he's really evil, yep, he's evil, he's doing terrible things, and it's the same thing over and over again. They're not building anything more and telling the readers more about this. You could just have tons and tons of text, a paragraph or a few pages giving loads of backstory to the villain, but that's kind of, no one likes data dumps and it slows down the pace of the story. But drip feeding information in as you go along from different points of view, picking up on different aspects, that's quite a unique approach, and I think that's quite a good one to do. It's better than just splashing loads of information on the page and then moving on. So to summarise, make your villains interesting, make them thoughtful, build them up layer by layer, think about their wants and their needs and their desires. Even if most of it never appears on the page, you've created this Bible for this character. You know who it is, you know where they're going, and you know what they want. And that makes them feel more realistic and more rounded to the reader. They have this idea that just off the edge of the page is a bunch more information. In this case, there is, because you've created it. And that's how I think you should go about creating villains, rather than just doing something that's really over the top and really ridiculous. Create an interesting character that you may not want to spend time with, but you do want to find out more about them. So that's all I'm going to talk about for today, but I will be back next week with another video.